Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Alexander. I'm honored to be the Chancellor here at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, and I want to welcome you to tonight's Tommy Thompson Center event. We're thrilled to have Christopher Bedford with us. We are thrilled always to collaborate with the Tommy Thompson Center for a variety of reasons. Every time I introduce one of these events, one of the most amazing things I've had to do in my life was actually to work for President Thompson for 2 years when I began as Chancellor at UW-Green Bay. Whenever we have these talks, you could really feel sort of his energy and spirit behind the reason that we have these events. And I want to just say that, as a university, we really pride ourselves on the idea that what a university should be doing is creating difficult dialogue. We should be welcoming any idea that comes to the university. We should be considering it, we should be questioning it, and we should be doing it in a civil way. And this is really, really important, I think, currently in the age that we live in, the age of social media and the other things that we have where the tendency is simply to shout as opposed to think. And so I really am grateful that you all chose to spend your evening with us tonight to do this and to hear our speaker. And before I introduce Aaron, I will just apologize to you. I said all of that, and then I also really pride myself on attending these speeches. I will tell you that we have several hundred students who are waiting for me in the Crest Center at our basketball game tonight for the chance to win a free scholarship for their tuition to be paid next year by hitting a shot at the basketball game, and I have to award that check. So it's the weirdest reason I've ever given for missing an event, but I do want to apologize to you that's why I can't stay for the talk tonight. But we're really thrilled to have Mr. Bedford here. It's great to have him on our campus. With that, I want to introduce Aaron Weincheck, who's a professor of political science here at UW-Green Bay and an amazing example of what I just spoke about, and does an amazing job in helping our students to think about all the issues that are happening in the world today and how, again, to create dialogue around them. So, Professor Weincheck.
Thanks, Good evening, everybody. Thanks for spending some time with us. It's really a pleasure to see all of you here, and we also have the event live streaming, so lots of people watching in that modality as well, so we appreciate however you decided to attend. My name is Aaron Weincheck. I'm the chair of political science, and I just want to do a couple of housekeeping things before I introduce our speaker. First of all, I want to thank Advancement for all their work. An event like this takes a lot of work behind the scenes. I want to thank Advancement for all that they did, and I also want to thank the Widener Center. We have such a beautiful space here. It's nice to be able to hold events like this and kind of spend some time thinking together, and you'll have a chance to dialogue with our speaker as well, so we'll get some engagement going. I just want to share a couple of comments on behalf of the Tommy Thompson Center. The Thompson Center is really delighted to be able to sponsor today's event and partner with UW-Green Bay. And just as a personal note, I want to say thank you to the Thompson Center staff, one of whom is here, which is Ruth, sitting down there. Please give Ruth a shout out and say hi to her if you haven't had a chance. Because Ruth is instrumental in events like this. Ruth, Alex, and Lily are really great partners. And I just want to tell you a little bit about the Thompson Center. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the Thompson Center was established to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. The Thompson Center seeks to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy by informing and inspiring current and future public leaders, fostering leadership skills, and promoting effective public leadership. And they work on a bunch of really, really cool stuff. To further those goals, they fund research, they do scholarships, they put on public events like this, and they honor exemplary speakers with the Distinguished Public Leadership Award. All of their events are free and open to the public. They're also live streamed, so they're accessible to lots of different people, and they also post all of their events online, so you can watch them even if you're not able to attend them in real time. For more information on their events, things that are upcoming, grant opportunities, other things that the center is up to, please check out their website. There's lots of really good stuff there. So now I want to introduce our speaker and get him talking instead of me. It's a real pleasure to welcome Chris Bedford to UW-Green Bay. He is a senior fellow at the Common Sense Society, where he's responsible for their print and online publications. Formerly, he was the senior editor at The Federalist, editor-in-chief of the Daily Caller News Foundation, and editor-in-chief of the New Guard magazine. He currently serves as vice chairman of Young Americans for Freedom and is on the boards of the Daily Caller News Foundation and National Journalism Center. He is a Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute, a Fellow at Hillsdale College, and a Madison Fellow. And his work has been published in places like The American Mind, National Review, and the New York Post, just to name a few. And he is also a frequent guest on Fox News and Fox Business. So I'll turn it over to Chris. He'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A. And if you have questions, store them in your minds, and I'll be around with a microphone when that time comes. So please join me in giving a nice Green Bay welcome to Chris Bedford.
Thank you, Professor, and thanks for coming out tonight on a Thursday. It's Thursday, right? Started early. I started in D.C. for me at 4:30 in the morning, but I woke up chipper and excited for this warm weather. It's literally the same weather here in Green Bay as it is in Alexandria, Virginia, like to the degree, which I hear is quite unusual. I was certainly expecting to pack more, but thank you also to the university and to the Tommy Thompson Center for having me tonight. And I guess what I'm here to talk to you about is American media, which is going through some tumultuous moments, much of which we deserve. Now, the rumors of the impending death of the American media are exaggerated, but not so greatly. The demise is very much real. We are in a downward trajectory as an industry. Now, there's a couple things that feed into that. There's a changing economy, which certainly bears some responsibility. Every few years, we think that we've figured out how to make money on the internet. You've got things like Monster.com or BuzzFeed or the Huffington Post that I remember looking at when I was starting off at the Daily Caller when I was in fledgling years and thinking, those guys have it made. Or Vice News, which was valued at over $5 billion just a few short years ago. And they're gone. And those that aren't gone are on their way out. Because as we've been figuring out every year, we still don't quite have a grasp of what the internet can do. Another reason, I think, for this demise that we've been experiencing in the media is ourselves, corporate media in particular. That means that includes the reporters, it includes the editors, it includes the executives and ad sales folks. And I hate to say it in a room full of news consumers, but news consumers bear some responsibility for this as well. Now, you say that you want news, and I strongly suspect the people spending Thursday night here actually do. But most folks don't. It's kind of surprising. I remember we ran a poll when I was at the Daily Caller, which is a conservative tabloid started in 2010 by Tucker Carlson and his roommate Neil Patel. We polled our readers and we said, what do you want to read about? What do you want us to work on? And absolutely, by far and away, the number one choice was investigative journalism that exposes corruption and waste and other problems in our government. And at the bottom of the list of things they clicked on was smutty entertainment coverage. But being in the back end, I could see what they clicked on. And those six-figure reporters who spent days and weeks and months putting together impactful and good stories would get hundreds, sometimes thousands of clicks. And that smutty entertainment coverage would get tens of thousands of clicks. Absolutely the top story every time. I mean, I got an email one time from a priest who sent me a screen grab of his screen, and he said, I love the Daily Caller, I come here all the time, but look at my suggested content. And it was all entertainment stories. He said, I'm a man of the cloth. This is embarrassing. And I had to tell him that his suggested content was based on personal browsing history. I'm sorry, Father, but you clicked on that bikini slideshow. Now, there's a reason that the Daily Mail is the number one most visited homepage on the entire planet. Now, the Daily Mail does a lot of good, interesting journalism. It's a British paper. But if you go to their homepage, well, there's a lot of tabloidy stuff. And you know, we shouldn't feel too bad about that because nowadays, you see, you associate the name Pulitzer with the highest end of great journalistic work. But if you went back and looked at the publications where he made his money to endow that prize with, well, it turns out that human tastes actually haven't changed that much. So don't be too hard on yourselves. There's an interesting piece that came out this year in The New Yorker that called what journalism is going through at this moment an extinction level event. And for those hundreds and thousands of journalists being laid off on the ash heap, basically. It might as well be, but I had a policy in our newsroom. Not all of our policies in our newsroom I think should be copied. Some of them I never would institute again. But one of them that I stand by is I banned the word unprecedented from copy. That which hath been is that which shall be, and that which hath been done is that which will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Now, that was written according to rabbinical tradition 3,000 years ago, but it is still true today. Modern journalists who live very much on Twitter often forget there is nothing new under the sun. In fact, there's very little that's even new in our short experiment in a republic. I read a headline last year, this is kind of dark, that said, "Anti-Semitism in Germany reaches all-time high." Now, that's dark. It's also shockingly ignorant. It's tragic what's going on in Germany, but I think we've seen higher levels of anti-Semitism. Ignorance amongst reporters and people whose job it is, supposedly, to make this money, to go out there and opine, it's incredible. It abounds. I mean, since you are here on a Thursday night, some of you may be self-loathing and addicted to politics enough to have watched the last Republican primary debate between Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. And DeSantis kept on talking about how we need to move forward with bold colors and not pale pastels. Now that's a quote from, a fairly famous quote from Ronald Reagan attacking Gerald Ford and the George H.W. Bush and the Republicans he felt were moving forward with pale pastels. But there was a number of top reporters and senior political editors who went out and thought that was an attack on Nikki Haley for wearing a pastel color. That ignorance is excusable amongst the journalists that I hire at a school. It is inexcusable for going past multiple editors and being voiced over and over again by senior political correspondents who I don't expect to know everything, but at least a couple Reagan quotes. But back to unprecedented. Now, we heard over and over again in the years 2016 through 2020, a very calm period in American history, how unprecedented everything was. The respect and the manners among politicians was at an all-time low. And it makes me think that very few of them can recall or read about maybe the press battles between our second and third president. One of Jefferson's personally hired men, for example, wrote that John Adams was, quote, "a hideous hermaphroditical character who has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman." And Adams repeatedly called his rival Alexander Hamilton, quote, "the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler," which at least was somewhat true. In 1828, the Cincinnati Gazette said that Andrew Jackson's mother was, quote, "a common prostitute brought to this country by the British soldiers." And that was the nice part of their slander against Andrew Jackson. But you don't need to go back 200 years to find just how unprecedented the seeming meanness of 2016 and 2017 and the tweets really were. All the cries of "this isn't normal," unfortunately, and I agree with you, it ought not to be normal, but it is. I mean, President Lyndon Baines Johnson famously exposed himself on the Senate floor to intimidate political opponents and would ask reporters we didn't like to sit in the bathroom while he used it in order to do interviews with him. It's just a disgusting intimidation tactic. Now, that's meaner than just a mean tweet, I think. At least I would prefer to be tweeted at. Or how about just the basic facts of the matter? So many journalists like to just put things into maybe one or two categories. A lot of people in the media, my colleagues, they seem to know about Hitler and the Holocaust, and they know about slavery, and everything else they learned from Twitter. But very little other history they seem to get. So, like, for example, who is the richest man to have ever sat in the White House? Some people might think it's Donald Trump because his dining taste is indistinguishable from Saddam Hussein's. Some people might say George Washington, who was among the richest men in the country at the time, but it was actually John F. Kennedy, whose stipend when he was president from his father was about $80 million right now, but he was set to inherit, had he lived, $1 billion. I mean, his father-in-law sat on the New York Times Stock Exchange board. His dad laundered money through the Catholic Church in my home of Boston to grease the wheels on his campaign. After his father-in-law and mother-in-law went through a nasty divorce, his mother-in-law married an heir to Standard Oil. And there was certainly nepotism in the Trump administration. Jared Kushner was a top person, and he was criticized for that. People, though, when they were talking about it, you'd hear comparisons. Who do you have to reach to for a comparison for nepotism? I saw newspaper articles comparing him to Adolf Hitler for doing nepotism. But, I mean, John F. Kennedy put his 35-year-old brother as Attorney General. He'd never actually served as a lawyer. His dad had gotten him a job as a legal counsel on some Senate committees in the past. And Jack Kennedy's quote, which really embarrassed his brother, was, "I just wanted to give him a little legal practice before he becomes a lawyer." But Adolf Hitler was the comparison that we reached to. That shows just kind of an historical illiteracy amongst so much of our press. And you hear a lot about that, these comparisons to the Nazis and the Confederacy. But back to my industry and its changing fortunes. Nathaniel Hawthorne said that fortunes are always rising and falling in America, and media is no different. But there is a problem that's deeper now. Sorry to pull a Rubio. By the beginning of the American Civil War, there were over 50 newspapers published in New York City alone. Now, these weren't all general interest. They had Catholic papers, Spanish-speaking papers, black-owned and black-run papers. But by 1900, before the big newspaper wars, New York still had 15 daily newspapers. By the summer of 1966, that number was reduced by 4, and times were tough. On the airplane over here, before I lost internet, I was reading a couple newspaper pages from August 1966 when the 5th one had just gone under. And publishers were blaming striking unions, and there were acquisitions, and there were consolidations, and there were closures. And back then, you kind of forget that newspapers were still very much a blue-collar business, a trade. Now it's one, I think, probably to its detriment, dominated by master's degrees and college degrees. But you kind of see this, too, if you watch that movie, which I love and also hate, All the President's Men. When they're in those meetings, you still see those guys in there who are gruff, smoking, they got ink stains on their fingers. They have fingers that are like thicker than the average chest of a modern journalist. And I think that book and that movie kind of helped make celebrities out of so much in the industry and kind of pushed us even further in the direction that America was already moving, which is a bit of, I know we're at college right now, but degree worship in the industry. But there were still good times ahead, very much so for journalism. I mean, by 1991, when Donald Trump was declaring bankruptcy, the New York Times was expanding dramatically. They were opening up bureaus in Brooklyn and in Queens and the Bronx. And the reason for that is because Long Island's Newsday was moving in on the New York Times' territory. It was so profitable to be in the industry at that time that people could try to take territory from the Times. In the 1990s, I mean, the Boston Globe, where I grew up, was thick with cultural criticism, with comics, with classifieds, and of course, the news. And in 1996, the New York Times, well, they launched their first website, but that's kind of just around the time that the glory days were ending. Maybe the internet had something to do with that. Craigslist had launched the year before, which was suddenly a window into taking away those classified ads. Monster.com would follow shortly afterwards. And now that Monster.com is no longer quite in its heyday. There was some poetry, too. They opened up in a town near me in Maynard, Massachusetts, and to kind of revitalize that town, they took the old mills that had sat dormant, unless you wanted to use illegal drugs, for years, and they turned it into a great office center, and the whole center exploded. And they actually had offered ownership to the Boston Globe before they started. And the Globe reportedly told them, quote, "Our grandfathers would roll in their graves before they'd share advertising revenue of the paper." Now, maybe they didn't quite realize this at the dawn of the internet, but you should not be taking all of the business wisdom from your grandfathers in an industry that changes as rapidly as journalism. And that was kind of just even the beginning. I mean, 2002 saw the launch of Gawker, which was famous in breaking some early taboos by showing a leadership board in the middle of the newsroom, the top click stories at that moment, causing competition. The that's kind of a metric that ethically previously had kind of been kept secret from reporters, because you really wanted them to focus on their job. If you wanted them to focus on clicks, then you could take your investigative reporters and have them make bikini slideshows, but you really wanted them to be holding power accountable. Gawker kind of changed that, and it was shocking at the time, but by 2016, the Washington Post did the same thing. If you walked into their newsroom, right in the middle of their newsroom, unlisted, with the top story, second, third, fourth, fifth, and guess what? They all had to do with Donald Trump. So if your job was reporting on corruption in the Washington, D.C. City Council, which is a juicy beat, you could do a clock every time one of them goes to prison and reset it. You wouldn't go very long. You just weren't getting those clicks, and reporters saw that, and they responded to those incentives, and they got famous from those incentives. But it even kind of turned out that page views were a false god, because when you have limitless prairie, which the internet essentially is, then land value has no premium, and advertising comes very cheap. I mean, by 2008, when a freshman senator from Illinois was running for office, the money that Gawker was earning per page view was half what they'd been making in 2004. And that's before a lot of folks were even just getting into the game, chasing that page view. But it wasn't just those folks who were chasing page views. In 2006 alone, the New York Times lost $543 million. Because in an age of free information, premium content struggled to compete. And it'd be another 5 years before the New York Times got up the courage to put up a paywall and say, I know everything's supposed to be free on the internet, but we do need to make a profit. Now, they were able to survive that time. Most companies can't lose $543 million in a year and survive. Smaller guys got wiped out. In the past 20 years, 3,000 newspapers have closed in this country. About 1/3 of American papers will have shut down by the time this year is over, between 2000 and this year. And those are mostly local papers, which are healthy. They push attention to local issues, a hyper focus on national politics that we cannot really, in truth, often affect, versus local politics where we really can, is unhealthy for the psyche. And also, I mean, even in Washington, D.C., it's unhealthy for Congress. I know a lot, maybe it's because of the people that are attracted to this, they feel like a mission nowadays in modern journalism. Even though a lot of local papers, even in red areas, are fairly liberal-leaning, you find on the Capitol Hill that a lot of those reporters are just there to do their jobs as opposed to become famous, like a lot of the national reporters are. And because of that, they ask better questions. They actually hold truth to power. Sorry, I hate it when people drink when they're talking, but I got something. So the surviving papers have had to adopt. The New York Times, you might have noticed, if you still subscribe, it kind of sells a lifestyle. And you got games, you've got cooking, you've got fashion, and it feels good to get the New York Times. It's like automatic membership in the American elite. Other places like The Blaze, they sell streaming services and television shows and podcasts alongside opinion. And they've gone slowly and steadily, and they're profitable. Nearly everything there is paywalled. Punchbowl is a newcomer, which you probably wouldn't read. I don't even read it. It serves it serves the day-to-day interests of the U.S. House and Senate and what's going on in politics. Them and Politico, while they have a lot of free services, they sell top-dollar professional subscription services to businesses and other folks. It's kind of a model that's allowed them to succeed. The Daily Caller News Foundation, which I used to lead, sells a vision of training journalists to donors. And I got news to you. Trying to get conservative donors to give money to journalism is difficult. But trying to convince them that something they think should be a profitable business needs their money for free, even more difficult. The left doesn't seem to have that kind of philosophical problem. I mean, even without the very robust charitable tradition of the United States, The Guardian in England has grown its income largely in part of donations over the last couple of years. It's still not quite breaking even, but it's been growing. Britain's oldest conservative magazine, actually the world's oldest conservative magazine, The Spectator, is slowly expanding in the United States, but it's risked by The Telegraph. Some of you may read The Telegraph, which has managed to run up $1.3 billion in debt and is part of the same company. Now, this, by the way, is a window into the insanity of the news business's economic realities. This quick story of the Telegraph and the Spectator. So the Telegraph is owned by the Barclays. Now, that's not the esteemed banking family. The Barclays are two, now very old, one of them's passed, twins and their children, who are kind of crazy English schemers who worked their way up, made a ton of money, bought a castle on an island, fought the locals, and ended up buying the Telegraph and running up $1.3 billion in debt. So eventually Lloyd's of London says, hey, I really don't think you're going to pay this off, so I'm going to seize it, and I'm going to sell your newspaper and your magazine at auction. Rupert Murdoch wanted to buy the Spectator. He had a personal attachment to it. A German company looked at buying the Telegraph for $330-something million and decided that it wasn't worth that. And then suddenly the Barclays came back and said, hey, all of our debts are paid off. We're going to take that back now. Well, who paid them off? The royal family of Abu Dhabi paid them off, and they brought on Jeff Zucker, formerly of CNN, and he was kind of their guy. Now, the Spectator's old-school chairman, Andrew Neil, was furious about that. The British government is now overseeing this deal if they're willing to sell marquee British media properties to Abu Dhabi. But at the same time, the British government has no idea what it's talking about, and every few weeks seems to discover what this business actually is. The state-owned BBC did a really entertaining but very indignant interview with the chairman of the Spectator. The Spectator, by the way, was founded to expand voting rights in England, and the chairman was indignant that they were being bought by a foreign monarchy. And BBC was like, well, aren't you free market? Isn't that okay? And it was a breakdown in this conversation that didn't quite work. And then they got in this ridiculous argument because the chairman said, I just don't think that a television executive who's liberal from America could run a print magazine that's conservative in England. And the BBC said, how do you know Jeff Zucker's liberal? Well, I don't know if you've watched CNN lately, but he seems to have a political bent of some kind. But the money's already changed hands, so we're going to see what happens there. It could be a lot of money. It could be interesting. And what of magazines more broadly? I mean, the ones we used to get that were thick with heavy stock paper and shimmering, there are some survivors, but if you flip through them, look at the advertisements. It's for like Rolex watches. I mean, literally private jet companies, Dolce & Gabbana. It shows that the audience that they survive off of is extremely elite and lucrative. That gone largely are the days of Time and Newsweek, although they keep on getting reborn every now and then, and they limp on. I mean, Condé Nast is wild. I was at a wedding this past summer in Greenwich, Connecticut, and that's where Condé Nast's headquarters were. And they had these pillars on each side of the road on the entrance and exit to where this massive campus was. Regal pillars, 100 years old. They got Vogue and Vanity Fair and The New Yorker carved into the side. And an amateur history buff at the hotel tried to gin up a campaign to kind of revitalize them because it hasn't taken off. I mean, they're basically ruins at this point to our magazine industry. In 2020, Condé Nast tried to revitalize itself by hiring a Disney executive to bring them into a new age of streaming content, see if that could make money. And she just left last October. In November, the CEO announced that he was going to try and do a new focus on subscriptions and e-commerce as a way to try and make their revenues up. In 2022, there were 2,681 layoffs in broadcast, print, and digital news media. Those layoffs hit NBC News, Vox, Vice, Business Insider, Spotify, The Skim, 538, The Atlantic, Condé Nast. BuzzFeed and Gawker closed. The Washington Post lost about $100 million. Just today, Vice announced it would stop publishing new content to its homepage, and hundreds of layoffs are incoming. Just in 2017, it was valued at $5.7 billion. Now, I could have told you then that was dumb, but it was a marquee property, and people were willing to pay it. So, yes, the American news industry is currently in free fall, and the reality is that while many aspects of this are outside of our control, so much of it is very richly deserved. 2016 was a watershed year, and I felt it in our newsroom. So the Daily Caller is kind of like a wild, wild west tabloid, at least it was back then. So we had a bar in our office. Most of our staff were just out of school. I paid them in peanuts and paper clips. They stayed late and worked hard in exchange for that beer that flowed at the bar, because I didn't pay them enough to afford to buy their own. And the folks over at the Daily Beast and other publications that had wildly different politics would come over all the time. And they'd play games at the end of the night and play cards. And I'd have lunch monthly with folks from the Journal, from the Free Beacon, from the National Review, from BuzzFeed. And we ribbed each other and made fun of each other, but then we'd bump cigarettes from each other. And our advertising executives' brothers used to make fun of him because they said he was a communist. But he was just there at the Daily Caller to make money, and he did a lot of that. He did very good in the advertising sales. But after Donald Trump was elected, that changed overnight. Now, Facebook had made buco bucks in politics in the previous years. Books were written about how smart the Obama campaign was to harvest data and to reach voters that Hillary Clinton and then McCain and later Mitt Romney barely even knew existed. But suddenly, it was no longer cool because Donald Trump had won. Then Facebook was accused of basically helping the worst kind of enemy. And I was in their offices in Manhattan on election night because they used to work with a lot of news outlets. And they had a great election board. They brought us in to live stream and call the election live. And the mood in there was getting more and more dour as the night progressed. And they'd already agreed with the Daily Caller to throw an inauguration party, which sounds kind of swampy and corrupt and somewhat is. But it was extremely standard fare in Washington because it allowed sponsors to rub shoulders with incoming administration officials while journalists got to meet people and got to start to develop sources and get cards and get an idea and also get some of those free beers. But after that night's party, there was a rebellion at Facebook amongst the junior staff who said, well, we can't collaborate with these people. And the managers who I knew said, what do you mean collaborate? We gave them some money, and we paid a couple bartenders, and we made some special Facebook pillows. And I said, well, that's collaboration. And new phrases started to appear that I hadn't heard before. Things like normalize. How dare you normalize this administration? Platforming. How dare you platform these people? Now, silence is violence, which is a strange and insidious thing that says you can't even be quiet. Trigger warnings were talked about in the offices of the New York Times if you were to have content that goes outside the norms of the New York Times. And that Facebook employee rebellion wasn't just confined to tech and these new young people. It hit the newspapers and it hit media business conferences where, if you've met these media business executives, they don't give a darn about anything but making money, which is their job. It's maybe morally questionable, but it's ethically completely fine. And at these conferences, suddenly politics took a precedence over profit. And there were these people who just sell ads and buy ads for a living talking about how to be part of the resistance. Newsrooms reacted similarly, but not at first. At first, there was shock. How did so many people miss the mood in the country to have called this election so incorrectly? I remember one of my favorites was a major publication promised that they were going to go on a listening tour to learn what they'd missed. They were going to go to all these red states, but they went to all the blue cities in the red states, which I understand because those are often the more fun places. But you're not going to learn a lot about why Texans voted for Trump by going to Austin. You're going to hear good music, see a great scene, maybe play oversized Jenga, but you're not going to learn what motivates voters. It's a very similar scene to New York. But even while skin deep, they were at least kind of trying to understand at first, well, what did we miss? And they really did miss it. But the backlash came quickly, and folks in these newsrooms started to ask questions that I don't think reporters would have asked previously, which is why would we even try to understand these people? They're racist and they're fascists. And once you've kind of othered a group of people so thoroughly, they're just othered. There's no need to actually try to understand them. You'd hear phrases like on the wrong side of history, which, well, if someone is on the wrong side of history and you're on the right side of history, then you can really justify a whole lot of action against them. Now, you might remember the name James Bennett. I'll tell you who he was in a minute, if not. He spent 15 years rising up in the New York Times the old-fashioned way, starting at the Metro desk, getting screamed at by an editor who still smoked inside, getting his job threatened over and over again. But he rose up. He became editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, And then in 2016, he went back to the Times as an editorial page editor. And he didn't realize how much things had changed in the decade that he was gone. So at times while he had been gone, the New York Times had nearly gone bankrupt. The financial crisis had occurred. They had the new kids in Huffington Post and Vox. And they had to kind of adopt to this new style that was coming out on internet blogging that really did seem to be the future. So while editorial opinion stayed marked as such, strictly editorial answers of the publisher separate from the news, a new kind of culture critic had entered into the news space that didn't answer to editorial. They were under news leadership, they weren't marked opinion, but they began to spread at the urging of their bosses a chatty first-person style of opinion that Vox and Huffington Post had made famous and successful. And they became some of the celebrity reporters of the New York Times, pushing opinion while not actually being under opinion or labeled as such. And it kind of makes you wonder, like, what's the point of an opinion section if the news has so much opinion too? The opinion department, James Bennett wrote in a retrospective last year, is a relic of the era when the Times enforced a line between news and opinion journalism. Editors in the newsroom did not touch opinionated copy lest they be contaminated by it, and opinion journalists and editors kept largely to their own, distant floors within the Times building. Now that fastidious may seem excessive, but enforced an ethos at the Times reporters owed their readers an unceasing struggle against bias in the news. But by the time I returned as editorial page editor, more opinion columnists and critics were writing for the newsroom than were writing for opinion, which had always been intentionally kept small. And at the cable networks, I'm sure you've noticed, the boundaries between commentary and news were basically completely wiped out. And there was little reason to believe that reporters weren't indulging in their biases anymore. And you see the same thing with the so-called fact-checkers, which is an absurdity that there exists. Here's where we report the news, and here's where the facts are. You'd think those things should be one and the same. But not only have they embraced this new thing, but it's been used, fact-checking, as kind of a cudgel to hit newspaper reporting that is not liked, or opinion that is considered outside the norm. Now, remember the lab leak theory? That COVID leaked from a lab in Wuhan, which was a totally plausible theory. Now, when Jon Stewart, former Daily Show host, came out and said, of course it's extremely plausible that this virus leaked from a lab, everyone laughed and applauded and said, all right, that's totally true. But if you wind it back, when the Federalist, where I worked, was saying it, or positing it, when different experts and scientists were suggesting it, when Senator Tom Cotton was suggesting it, we're getting fact-checked as false. The New York Times did this. The Guardian, Business Insider, The Daily Beast, MSNBC, Huffington Post, Arkansas Times, Washington Post, Forbes, CNN, The Atlantic. The list goes on of people who said, fact check, false. Now, what's insane about this is that where the virus came from was a literally uncheckable fact. It was one theory versus another. Maybe someday we'll figure it out. I'm somewhat doubtful. But at the same time, as a steady march of opinion into journalism was going on, declining revenue had also forced the New York Times and a lot of other papers to get rid of a lot of the editors that they used to have, a lot of the checks they used to have. The Atlantic was known. It used to write articles about how great their fact-checking was. They don't have a fact-checking department anymore. And the old Times practice of making reporters work in the Metro section for a year before they got a tryout to join the national desk was over. They just started hiring them. And that started to suffer. So reporters who had less training than ever were also more assured of their own righteousness and truth than ever before. Now back to quoting Bennett. This environment of enforced groupthink inside and outside the paper was hard even on liberal opinion writers. One left-of-center columnist told me he was reluctant to appear in the New York office for fear of being accosted by colleagues. Even columnists with impeccable leftist bona fides recoiled from tackling the subjects when their point of view might depart from progressive orthodoxy. Now, to give you a clue, Bennett is a guy who generally agrees with the pieties and ideas of liberalism. He's certainly not a Republican or a conservative. And I've mentioned him twice now, and the reason you might remember him is because he was forced to resign from the New York Times in 2020. And the reason for that was he had printed the opinion of a sitting U.S. senator who had direct influence on the White House. who had said that the U.S. military should assist in maintaining order amid that summer's deadly riots. The op-ed was called "Send in the Troops." Now, that's an unpopular opinion, maybe, but it was one that the mayor of D.C. had shared just a few days earlier when she asked for troops to help restore order in D.C. It's one, when I was reporting in Milwaukee, that I found not from elites or from Republicans, but from bartenders and hotel bellhops who were worried about where we could park our cars when we stayed there to report that summer. But Bennett became a victim of kind of a mob mentality amongst Times reporters who claimed that he'd put their safety at risk by publishing a U.S. senator's opinion. Now, he got an email from one Sam Dolnick, who was one of the publisher's cousins and a top editor at the Times, who said that Bennett owed the staff, quote, an apology for appearing to place an abstract idea like open debate over the value of our colleagues' lives and their safety. So far from seeking truth and airing debate, Dolnick thought that by publishing the essay, the message was, quote, we don't care about their full humanity and their security as much as we care about our ideas. Now, a great irony in all of this is that one of the commentary editors who was involved in this story was the only one who actually received death threats of the entire staff, and that was because of the newsroom who attacked him. But that wasn't bias, which was interesting. Now, the New York Times and its ilk have always struggled with bias. The top editors will tell you that that's a difficulty you have, and it's true in any newsroom, it's true in any company that has to work in this. So, I mean, look, they all recruit from the same places. Now, the New York Times has largely always been a white publication, but they've been working very hard to change diversity of skin color, to diversity of sexuality over the years, to add more women. But still, all these reporters and editors come from the same top universities. They all still share a lot of the same ideas. If you were to go to the New York Times newsroom and say, how many of you go to church every Sunday? Or how many of you even voted for Mitt Romney? Forget about Donald Trump. You're not going to get a lot of hands. There's not a huge amount of diversity. That was something that they wanted to tackle when they first brought on Bennett in 2016. Explicitly, we want that. But you can see it in their reporting, and it's always been the case. I mean, we pine for the 1960s when it was supposedly objective, but really what the 1960s were just a news media monopoly. Some of you might remember the Goldwater Rule, which was instituted by the American Psychiatric Association, I think it's called, after a newspaper put out like these 600 psychiatrists who'd never sat down with Goldwater say he is a madman who is unfit to be president. These were licensed psychiatrists. And this was considered unethical at the time, so they made a rule that you're not supposed to do that, and they taught that in journalism school. Which is not worth the degree, I've got it, but that's one of the things you're supposed to learn. Nowadays, I mean, you turn on Fox News, which I go on all the time, or CNN, and you hear people opining on the mental health of folks that they've never actually sat down and spoken with as a daily routine. That rule's out the window. But this, what Bennett was dealing with, wasn't kind of your traditional liberal bias. This wasn't even kind of the basic groupthink or the wanting to belong to the cool kids table that's so pervasive among the nerds of journalism. It was an illiberal bias. So it wasn't favoring one side over the other. It was saying that one side should not be allowed to speak, which is a whole different and kind of new thing in American journalism. So Bennett, I'll quote again, this is an hour-long piece you can read at The Economist. Illiberal journalists have a different philosophy, and they have their reasons for it. They are more concerned with group rights and individual rights, which they regard as a bulwark for the privileges of white men. They are not out to achieve social justice as the knock-on effort to pursuing truth. They want to pursue it head-on. The term objectivity to them is code for ignoring the poor and the weak and cozying up to power, as journalists, I admit, have often done. So while a lot of newsroom bosses do say they want to move against this, they really are afraid to. And the pressures don't just come from inside the newsroom and young staff, but they come from outside. I mean, the New York Times was struggling in 2016. They were always going to succeed because a billionaire is always going to want to back them. But in the 4 years of the Trump presidency, they gained 5 million subscribers. The Washington Post, a smaller paper, gained 2 million subscribers. But those subscribers are a fickle bunch, so they signed up for liberal news. And when they didn't think that the reporters of the New York Times or the Washington Post were asking hard enough questions or serving up things that confirm their biases well enough, they'd unsubscribe. And they did some polling, the Times did, and they found that, well, a lot of their subscribers did want a paper that was liberal. They also wanted one that was politically independent, which seems like a paradox until you realize like how human it is to want a vaunted publication to be independent and at the same time agree with all of your priors. It makes you feel good. Now, the founder of National Review, on the other side of the aisle, Bill Buckley, once published a book compilation of his belligerent correspondence with his own readers called Cancel Your Own Damn Subscription. And the Times editor-in-chief seems to share some of this. Dean Baquet, who used to pine for the days of advertising, he said that the advertisers at least didn't think that they owned the journalism, where the subscribers seemed to. So, well, the Times has since worked hard to hook you, and it's hooked me for sure, with their cooking and with Wordle and recipes. And in the first year of the Biden presidency, they started to falter a little bit. I mean, the Washington Post lost 300,000 of those 2 million subscribers in the first year. Now, as we all know, some of that was just burnout. I mean, you can only be outraged for so long before you go crazy. But how much of this has changed since the days when the New York Times kind of had unchallenged authority in American politics and American media? I mean, how much has changed since Walter Cronkite would end his nightly CBS broadcast with, "and that's the way it is," or "that's the way it was"? Martin Gurry's got a really great book called The Revolt of the Public that's about the absurdity, or one he mentions the absurdity of Cronkite ending his broadcast with, "and that's the way it was." He says, "It's crazy that the clash and turmoil of billions of human lives dwelling in thousands of cities and organized into dozens of nations could be captured in 3 or 4 mostly visual reports lasting a total of less than 30 minutes. But American viewers had no access to what they were missing." Now, with the incredible explosion of new information that's kind of come alongside the collapse of our media, the monopoly that so much of the newspapers had has gone with it. And with that monopoly has gone its authority, which you often find when monopoly is taken away. I mean, the state holds a monopoly on violence, and when that's no longer true, the state rapidly begins to lose authority. Bad men, young Abraham Lincoln warned, don't respect the state when it no longer has that monopoly. And good men just lose faith in it when they see that anyone can do violence. I mean, the Catholic Church held the keys to heavens, and for millions it alone held the monopoly on salvation. But today, like just a few miles from here, are dozens of churches that disagree with that. Now, because of that, kings no longer bow when the Pope says to. I mean, local mayors will shut it down during COVID if they feel empowered. The monopoly is over, and with it, some of that temporal authority seems to have been taken. And corporate media no longer holds that monopoly on information. A kind of a mind-blowing study by University of Pennsylvania, Berkeley, found that more information was generated in 2001 than in the entirety of previous human history. The next year doubled 2001, producing 140,000 Library of Congress's worth of information, and the trend of doubling every year has continued. Now, you know, of course, that a lot of that is junk, but it's still, the amount that is being produced is incredible. So these papers can be challenged, and the authority is over, and in place of that authority, they have to build on trust. And don't worry, I'll wrap up soon. Now, so far, the media has really failed at building that trust. Far from building that trust, we've squandered it. A lot of reporters have lost faith in the American people. There's open contempt, you'll read in some of these papers, for the voters. And the media, because of that, is entirely unfit for the crown that it claims to wear. It's become toxic. But here's the catch, and that's where I'll end. The media is needed. Reporting is needed. Journalism is needed. This stuff, in order for us to have a free people and a society that works together, we need to figure out this problem. Fortunately, we are Americans. I'm working now with a different university, Belmont Abbey College, to build a journalism master's program because we need journalists. We're building it to try and give them a good idea of ethics as well as history and some things I've noticed that are lacking. And AI can't replace it. You cannot simply be outsourced. It needs to be reborn, and that's necessary. So we're still working out the business model. By the way, if any of your kids are thinking about this, don't follow this path to get rich or to be lazy, because it's going to be a lot of work, a lot of hard work. You might have wished you had a different career path. I once invited the editor-in-chief of the Daily Caller to speak to a class of college students at the National Journalism Center, and he opened up his speech saying, "What terrible mistake did you make in life to end up here before me?" I laughed, but he had a point, and some of those kids are today winning awards in journalism. So I won't tell you that it's easy, but I wouldn't choose any other way, and I hope that we continue down this, and we're Americans. We'll figure it out. Thank you.
Questions, and I'll bring you the mic.
I was worried I'd go too short.
I'll try to keep tabs. I know we're getting close to the end, but maybe a question or two. So I'll start here, and then I'll go over there.
So where do we find the truth?
I mean, the media for most of human history, when human media is not that old, printing press, has been largely partisan. I mean, you go back, you have I don't know about Green Bay, but say the Philadelphia Democrat, the Philadelphia Republican, the Philadelphia Whig. If you go back to the early papers used to be held at the museum, you'd find the Catholic paper that was super stoked that a town had been slaughtered and put to the sword, and you'd find the Protestant paper that was unhappy about that. So unfortunately, at this moment, you have to really be a discerning consumer. You have to try and read as much as possible. But pay attention. I mean, understand that your trust is currency. That's all they have to offer you. One of my favorite things to do is to read about things that I know about, because we have a cult of expertise completely. Where I used to think, for example, that the BBC was a very good source of news when I read about international stuff that I had no idea about. And it's like, the BBC seems to have the best news I've ever read on Nigeria, knowing nothing about Nigeria. But then I read the BBC coverage of like evangelical Christians in South Carolina, and it basically read like Jane Goodall interpreting what the monkeys were doing. And I thought, well, maybe BBC is actually not that expert, but I'd always assumed they were. So one thing to do is to try and look at things that you are actually expert in. And does that publication represent those things well? And if they do, then maybe that trust can extend beyond that to things that you have to rely on them for. But call balls and strikes, and remember, I mean, if people get lazy, if you catch them like Sports Illustrated writing with artificial intelligence, then maybe there's not that much intelligence there.
So I'm actually the chair of the college Dems on campus, and I've noticed one of the things you're talking about, there is this hyper-partisan my team or their team. Like,
Yeah.
I tried to invite the college Republicans to things. I got pushed back by the college Dems, and they're not that interested in talking to me either.
Well, good for you.
But I guess I'm curious, how much of this do you think traces back to the repeal of the fairness doctrine that would empowers journalists with an agenda to push rather than passionate about the truth?
Well, it's kind of hard to figure out, because before the repeal of the fairness doctrine, there was a smaller news environment and one that was dominated. I think people would like to look back and say those things were fair, but people also like to look back and say that Reagan was a very unifying president, where if you look back and look at the news broadcasts at the time, he was criticized all the time and attacked all the time. So we always have a little bit of rose-colored vision about the past. Repealing the fairness doctrine has kind of allowed, first, the American right, which was much better at this than the American left, to thrive in opinion. You got Rush Limbaugh's, the magazines are already taken, a lot of the opinion news sites. But it hasn't really allowed the American right, has failed to do a lot of original news reporting. So while you see these opinion makers crafting all these sandcastles, they're doing it in a sandbox that was built by the New York Times and the Washington Post. Most of the facts they have to work with were things that were reported by outlets that largely disagree, which has a balancing power on it in general. But more than the fairness doctrine or any kind of government action, which I'm not always opposed to at all, my libertarian friends call me a statist, I think that social media and the internet, which was kind of promised falsely as being something that would bring us together and allow us to become more enlightened and closer to our neighbors, has really just allowed us to go down wormholes and to really isolate ourselves from differing opinions and go to places that don't ever challenge our preconceptions, and to become obsessed in a way that probably maybe started in 2001 with September 11th, maybe a little bit before that, with just obsessed with national news as opposed to local news and glued to conflict. And even if there was a fairness doctrine again, the profit aspect still knows that people click on outrage, which is why we're so exhausted after 2016. I mean, you go to, my friend was just in South Carolina trying to cover that like already over primary, and very differently from previous years, there's no Trump signs anywhere. I mean, people are just tired. They're just like, whatever, who's going to win? So I don't know if the fairness doctrine would fix it. We have to tackle social media, and I've got an article coming out tomorrow morning in Compact about this. We're basically at the 100-year anniversary of when the, give or take, that's my hook, but it's kind of blurred, the Industrial Revolution, which was promised to bring incredible growth and expansion and wonderful things to the world, and largely did, where we finally started to recognize also all the horrors that it had brought to the world, that we were feeding children into machines, that we were destroying our cities in some ways, we were destroying some of our rural communities, that there were real costs to this growth. And we have to kind of get to a point, too, where we look at the real costs that social media and technology has brought along with the pluses. The fact that our mental illness among teenagers is skyrocketing in every Western place. The fact that screen addiction and ADD are out of control, that the rise in suicide and the rise in polarization, and really begin to tackle what is an industrial revolution moving at 1,000 times the clip. They're making a lot of money on factories, too. But it really does take, I think, outrage.
I wonder if you could comment on this, given your historical perspective. To what extent do you think the media in current days has outsourced skepticism? Is that a historical trend, or is that something that's stayed stable, or where does skepticism play its role in society now?
It's hard to say. I mean, the media wasn't skeptical for a lot of kind of modern broadcast history. It really started to get skeptical after Vietnam and Watergate. And that was a good thing, that skepticism of holding truth to power. And you see it kind of, it goes away. It depends on maybe, I think Barack Obama, because he was such a celebrity figure and so popular, did a lot of damage to the skepticism of a lot of papers. I remember getting the news press release from the Washington Post when Donald Trump won election that they were reconstituting their investigative unit. And I thought, did you not have it for the last 8 years? I hadn't noticed it had gone away. I don't read the Washington Post as closely as I should, but there was a lack of skepticism because of the partisanship that had entered. And, it makes a fool of you. When I was reporting for the Federalist, which is a conservative newspaper, I was in north of Detroit talking to a bar owner in an area where it was right outside where the auto worker factory was. And everyone in there was wearing a Trump hat, despite what the union spokesman was saying. The bartender was an avowed Democrat, and he didn't want me to mess with his business, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to talk to me from the Federalist. But then I told him, I was like, what's the point of me flying out here to Michigan to talk to you, to write a story I could have written in D.C.? I would learn nothing. My readers would learn nothing. It'd be a waste of your time, and it'd be a waste of the trust that I was given. I'm here to report on what you say. So I had to send him a couple articles. He went back in his office and read them, and then came back and said, fine, I can talk to you, and we can go on the record, which was a gratifying moment. That skepticism, it's ebbed and flowed. It's risen and fallen in American history, and I think it was healthy to see it during the Trump years. I think it went a little bit far when you saw reporters screaming at the president during like the Easter egg roll. But it's healthy to see, and it looks like it's a little late right now, but it's starting to come back a little bit even for this administration. I know they're very angry at the New York Times at this moment because the New York Times stopped pretending that everything was fine. Well, thanks a ton, guys. This was wonderful.
That takes us right to our exact time moment. Can you join me in giving Chris Bedford one more round of applause? On behalf of UWGB and the Tommy Thompson Center, thank you. I hope to see you at future events. Check out their website for live stream videos of previous talks. There's tons of great resources there. Please drive safely, and I hope to see you soon.